In this episode of the Business of E-commerce, I talk with Andrew Henderson about how to move to a tax haven and pay zero taxes. This is the Business of E-commerce, episode 122. Welcome to the Business of E-commerce, the show that helps e-commerce retailers start, launch, and grow the e-commerce business. I'm your host, Charles Plesky, and I'm here today with Andrew Henderson. Andrew is the managing partner at Nomad Capitalist, where he helps people find the best places to live, bank, invest, incorporate, start a business, hire, and date. I asked Andrew on the show today to chat about how you can move to a tax haven and pay zero taxes. So, hey, Andrew, how you doing today?
Great to be with you.
Yeah, awesome to have you on. I'm super interested in the topic on kind of moving to a tax haven.
Mm.
It's something I've not actually talked to someone about before, and it's one of those things you hear, but you don't even know, or at least I don't know sometimes what it means. You hear of tax havens, and you hear of large companies doing this thing where they just move somewhere and pay less taxes. But I never really know, like, is that something we can do as smaller businesses, or like how does this even work? So this is something so we're not actually offering tax advice here. I think you're always supposed to state that, but so what exactly, when you start talking about moving a business to a tax haven, what does that mean?
Well, there's actually four parts to it. I call it the tax friendly quadrant, right? So what people think is, oh, you just put your company somewhere else, and you can pay less tax by just moving your company to the Cayman Islands, and you sit around in Boston or Los Angeles or Sydney or whatever. It's not quite that easy if you're not Google or Amazon or Starbucks. But the reality is, I mean, what those companies have done is they have basically planted a flag of convenience in places around the world that allow them to keep more of their own money. And so what my five magic words are go where you're treated best. In the United States, I paid north of 40% in taxes as an entrepreneur. I ran several businesses there before selling a couple and letting a couple go and moving overseas full time. And so now, I'm able to establish my company in a place that charges basically zero tax or very close to it. I'm able to live overseas personally in places that don't demand tax from me personally. And so by matching those two things up, I'm able to pay a very, very low rate of tax. And people can do this, including Americans.
So the two parts are, you can put the business in one country and you physically live in another country, right? So there's no income tax and no business tax, is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, so what the tax-friendly quadrant or the tax-free quadrant is all about is where are you leaving, where are you arriving on both the personal side and the business. Again, I mean, there's this idea that anyone can open a Belize company or something or a Caymans, whatever, and you just pay zero tax while you take one trip a year to have your board meetings in Belize. That's not how it works. There's things like controlled foreign corporation rules, permanent establishment, all kinds of different rules. And so the countries don't necessarily have to be the same. Obviously, if you're an American, you're leaving the United States, and your company's probably in the United States. So both of those are leaving. Now, there are certainly places like the Cayman Islands you can go and set up your business, and you can live there, and it's just a tax-free place. The UAE, same kind of thing. However, you're not restricted to just those places. So you might have a company in the UAE, but you might want to live where I'm at right now in Malaysia. Or, what I've done originally for lifestyle reasons, but it actually happens to have an impact on your taxes sometime, is I'll do what I call the trifecta method, where I split my time between about 3 different homes over the course of the year. And so I'm not spending too much time in one place. Now, that's something I personally enjoy doing. You don't have to do that. But for someone who wants to bounce around and spend some time in countries that have higher taxes, it's a way to do that without, getting stuck. So there's lots of different permutations of it. But that's basically how it works.
Okay, so a lot is based on how much time throughout the year, so entire year, how many days, weeks, months you actually spend in a particular place, right? Because certain countries, there's different rules around this, where you might have to spend 12 months out of the year or 1 week. Is that kind of one of the things there?
Yeah, I mean, occasionally there's a situation where we have someone who runs a relatively large business, and they're able to stay in the United States or something part of the time. while everything else happens offshore. It's a lot easier if the people who are running the business, if the owners of the business, at least people kind of managing the business, are actually physically overseas. And so, yeah, I mean, again, it's leaving and it's arriving. As I always tell people, you can leave the United States or Australia or the UK, whatever. You can leave and spend 0 days in your country, but if you go and live 9 months a year in Paris, now they're going to tax you, and it's going to be even worse, right? So the amount of time that you spend outside of your own country is going to vary country to country, and they're making it more difficult all around the world. I mean, so there used to be something called the 183-day rule, where basically, if you were in, let's say, Australia, that was your country, and you were there fewer than 183 days, that was basically open and shut. You're not a tax resident there. Now there's a lot more tests. There's a lot more boxes to check. In the United States, there's a couple of different ways to go about it. You can spend anywhere from 6 months all the way down to 3 or 4 months, or all the way down to 1 month, depending on which lifestyle options you choose. Other countries, the UK, you might spend anywhere from 6 weeks up to about 4 months. So yeah, I mean, depending on the approach that you take, you're going to spend a decent amount of time overseas. Depending on the approach you take, you may need to live in one particular place. You may need to have a main home, or you can just be a traveler. I mean, again, there's many permutations, but it's interesting to kind of design the lifestyle that you want.
You said you're currently in Malaysia, right?
I spend a good part of my time in the year in Malaysia. Yeah, I'm here now.
And are you an American citizen originally?
I am a U.S. citizen originally,
And
and so yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, do you have to give that up, or do you have to like get other citizenship, or like how does that part work?
Well, so let's clarify because maybe people don't understand this, and people when they really understand it, it surprises them. The United States is effectively the only country in the world that taxes its citizens no matter where they live. So for the 5 years, I actually renounced my U.S. citizenship in December of 2017.
Okay.
For the 5 years or so, 4 to 5 years preceding that, I spent very, very, very little time. I mean, like literally 0 days some years, 6 days another year. Very little time in the United States. Yet I continued to file tax returns that looked like a small town phone book, and forms that reported my foreign companies and all that. Now I paid very, very little, and I think some years zero in tax to the United States. And so it's possible to pay relatively little to the United States. It's hard to really pay zero these days, although it can be done sometimes. But you don't have to give up your citizenship. What giving up your citizenship does, I mean, for me, it was much more personal reasons. I never really identified with it. I really didn't plan to return. And so it's just been something that for years I had wanted to do. And then when I saw things getting worse for expats, I just decided I have other citizenships. I'm out. But you don't have to. In fact, most people we work with, they don't. It might cost you a bit more. You're going to have a bit more planning. You're going to have a bit more form filing. But, I think for a lot of folks, especially people who are living in the U.S. now and they're just moving overseas for the first time, they're not going to give up their citizenship. It took me years of living overseas before I finally did it. So you don't have to do that at all.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the first questions that came to mind. Is something you have to kind of jump head deep in the pool, or can you just kind of, try this out a little bit? And it sounds like it's pretty easy to try. And so you just get a visa at this other country, right? That you're going to?
Well, so everybody else, by the way, and if you're an Australian, let's just take Australians. I don't know if you have Australians, but you leave Australia and you check all the boxes. And again, the list has gotten longer than before. But if you check the boxes, you could just be out. And if you want to come back 5 years later, no problem. They won't tax you. They won't require you to file anything. The U.S. Is different now. Yeah, what you need to do, to get set up in the other country depends on where you want to go. The cool thing about being a U.S. citizen is, depending on how much time you need to spend in the U.S., they don't necessarily care where you're going. Other countries are increasingly saying, "Cool, you can leave. You don't have to pay us anything, but where are you going to be? Like, where are you going? Where's your new home? Do you have a driver's license there? What's going on?" The U.S., under many of the circumstances, doesn't really care. And so you might just choose. I mean, what I started doing, because I wanted to research and study all this stuff, was I would just spend a month at a time in different countries. or even a couple of weeks at a time. And so on that, you can largely just do tourist visas, right? If you want to live somewhere full time, then yeah, you might get a residence permit. You could do that by starting a business in the country, buying real estate in the country, putting money in the bank in the country, showing that you've just got a large enough salary. There's many different ways to get residence permits. You could buy a citizenship in a country. There's many different ways to get immigration status in different countries. But again, I mean, the benefit of a U.S. citizen or a Western citizen is, if you're using my approach of splitting your time between different places, you might even get away with just a tourist visa.
Okay, because tourist visas could be weeks or even months, right? So you could actually, if you're splitting multiple locations throughout the year, you could just have like string together a bunch of these.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, I own property in my main properties that I spend time in are in Montenegro, Malaysia, Colombia, and Georgia. Georgia, by the way, you get 360 days. So that's
that's
basically a
that's
resident.
a long vacation.
That's a long vacation.
Yep.
I bet if you left for a week or two and then came back, they wouldn't really complain too much. Malaysia, Montenegro, Colombia are all 90 days. Colombia, I think, is 90 per 180. Malaysia, I think, is probably more flexible. Montenegro, the same. So, it depends on where you want to live. I have one gentleman that we helped who, he likes to spend his time between the U.S., Germany, Spain, and Portugal. So those are all pretty high tax countries. It's a real balancing act, making sure none of them really nail him. And so we had to set that up very precisely with a tax home in his case. But if you're looking to spend time in the European Union or the UK, I mean, they're really strict. Australia, they're kind of strict. If you're looking for more of the emerging countries that I really prefer, then they're going to be more flexible generally, especially to an American or a British person or whatever.
Gotcha. On the business side, so let's say someone's listening right now, they have a US based business and they're thinking, okay, let's get started there first. Let's say you own a house in the US and it sounds like a pretty approachable way of doing it is first moving the business. What would your thought process be on, okay, like where do you even start looking? Like what would that decision making process even look like?
Well, obviously, I think you want to start at, what are the low tax or zero tax or tax exempt jurisdictions where, offshore businesses can be exempted, for example. There are a number of questions that you need to ask to figure out what's the best jurisdiction. If someone's running a consulting business, then you can probably set up just a foreign corporation in a place like a UAE free trade zone or any number of places. And you can just get a bank account somewhere for that company, and then you just have people wire you the money. That's pretty straightforward. Now, if you're an American, the thing to keep in mind with consulting business is you have to have a business to be offshore. You can't really have a profession. So if it's just you providing all the services, like you're a lawyer and you do all the work, that's not really going to work. You need to have a business, right? But that can be a pretty simple structure. If you're selling stuff, as I know you guys are on e-commerce, then you need to figure out, okay, how am I structuring this to where I can have, my foreign company that can also have a way to process my credit cards or a place where Amazon wants to pay me or whatever the case may be. And so that gets into not necessarily more complicated, but you might need two structures. So it's really a matter of asking yourself, how do you get paid? How's the money coming in? Then it's also a matter of making sure that, you deal with any connections in the United States. You can sell stuff into the United States while being overseas and not necessarily pay U.S. tax. But if you have a whole office of people in the U.S., they either need to be moved or they need to be segregated, and you need to do some special work to address that. So, how are you getting paid? Where are the employees? Where's the work being done? What kind of products are being sold? Those are all things that I would start with. I think that's where I would start. And also understanding that the world of tax havens are changing. A lot of these smaller countries have gotten bullied by the bigger countries into getting out of the tax haven business. So the Cayman Islands is still there. That's expensive. But, the smaller little rinky-dink jurisdictions like Belize, Seychelles, those really aren't that effective for most people anymore. These kind of like zero tax, never file a report, never do anything. Who cares? We won't check on you. It's kind of been put out of business. So you want a company offshore that has a bit more prestige, right? You don't want to be in some bottom of the barrel jurisdiction. You want to go somewhere with a bit of an image and a bit of heft to it. So I mentioned the UAE is one of many examples, but this is not some fly speck island in the middle of nowhere. The UAE, it's a serious country, and I would look at that kind of place.
Yeah, because my first thought that comes to mind is getting even a credit card processor to work with you, right? Like if you're in the US and you're working with Stripe, that's easy. You can start that account in about 2 minutes. But if you're in, like you said, some small island, I don't know how, like, if the processor will even sign up with you, work with you. Like that seems like more of a dicey situation. So it sounds like even that reason alone, the UAE or something like that makes more sense.
Yeah. Well, right. So you want to make sure you're in the right place so you can get that. I mean, sometimes we put together multi-part structures. I mean, again, my thing is go where you're treated best. And so what that means is cherry pick. Okay. You might live in a country that's the best country for you. For me, I like living in Malaysia. Immigration is relatively straightforward. Do I want a company in Malaysia? They have a low tax jurisdiction called Labuan. It's kind of the tax haven of Malaysia. It's not as popular or it's not as well known, which may not necessarily be a good thing. But I choose to live here. I might choose to have the core, operating, the kind of the top company of my organization being in a place like the UAE. I may want subsidiaries that help me do billing, or related companies. And so there's things like transfer pricing and all that come into play. So it can get a little tricky. But yeah, depending on what you're selling, depending on where the customers are, I mean, you have to take all these things into account, because what I do see is people will go to a guy in Panama, and guess what happens when you talk to a guy in Panama? He sells you on Panama, right? And what I've seen is people, they go up and sign up in Panama or Hong Kong, whatever, then they can't get a bank account. Then they can't, then they finally get the bank account, then they can't get a merchant account. It's just kind of a never-ending spiral of problems. Whereas if you look at it holistically from day one, rather than just going to the place with zero tax, zero reporting, zero anything, that sounds great, but doesn't really work with anything else you're doing, the holistic approach, I think, wins.
Hmm. How would it work though? Because you're mentioning where the employees are, but let's say you have a physical warehouse, a physical presence in the US, or you're mostly selling into North America, that sort of thing. You're working with manufacturers in the US. How would that work if you're pretty much doing all your actual sales into the US and even you have physical locations there? Can you still do this, or are you stuck into like a gray area there?
Well, I mean, we're getting in an area where, obviously we want to be very careful. We're not giving tax advice. We're being very
Yes.
cautious. There
We're,
are
we're
so
not
many
actually
different.
giving tax advice. We'll caveat
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I mean, here's the thing. There's so many different ways to look at it. Is it possible to have people doing warehousing work for you? Yes. Um, can you sell into a market? Yes. Obviously, I have people who are our clients who are in the United States. Now we're in the services business more than the goods business. There is a difference, and so there's a different way to handle that. But can you sell stuff into a country? Sure. People all around the world sell stuff into other countries. And we've helped people who are drop shippers, Amazon sellers, Shopify, whatever. Um, but understand, the more elements you add, the more complex it becomes. Okay. I have a theory of scorched earth versus scalpel. And again, this can apply to you personally. This can apply to the business. When I left the United States and spent 0 days a year there, that's scorched earth. Right. That's like, there's no gray area that I'm not here. On the business side, if you can use a third party warehouse, that may be preferable to buying, your own warehouse and having your own guys there. I have a guy we just finished up with who has his own guys. He actually has a storefront that doubles as a warehouse for his online presence. It was more involved. We had to do, more parts of the structure and kind of move money around the structure. So the more that you want to use a scalpel, the more that you want to say, well, hey, let me keep this, and hey, this guy's going to stay there, and hey, what about this? It becomes a bit more complicated. I'm not saying it's not doable, but everything, obviously adds expense. You need 3 companies instead of one. But certainly you can sell into countries, countries with VAT. You generally need to pay VAT no matter where you're incorporated. Um, but you can sell stuff into these countries. It's just a matter of making sure it's done properly and making sure you have everything documented properly.
Yeah. Okay. Because I've seen several folks do this, and they either use like a drop shipper or move their goods into a 3PL, and they're just paying the 3PL to sell on their behalf. And they live wherever, but the 3PL owns their warehouse, and they're basically paying the 3PL, a service charge. So that kind of sounds like something that would make your life a lot easier. at that point.
Yeah, here's the other thing about tax. I mean, right? So I had, when I lived in the United States, one of the best firms where I lived in Phoenix, Arizona. They did my taxes. I had businesses in the U.S. and they did a great job. The minute I was overseas, they couldn't answer the most simple of questions. I mean, foreign earned income exclusion. I had to fight them for I don't know how long that I qualified. They finally said, "All right, fine, you qualify." They don't know international tax. It's a very small circle of folks who know international tax and actually know it. And I've seen so many people who've come to me and I've said, "Hey, did you file your Form 5471?" They said, "Yeah, I think so." I said, "Go check before we do this. Make sure you were in compliance." "Oh, my accountant missed for 4 years. I've got a $40,000 penalty. We have to fight now." So you know, sometimes even people in the international tax space will agree, or sorry, will disagree. My preference is generally to be more conservative. You have guys who have kind of aggressive opinions. But yeah, I think the more third party stuff you can do, the better. The more freelancers, the better. This is just kind of generic advice. But, when we had someone who he had a whole sales team in the U.S. like calling and knocking on doors. I'm like, oh, that's gonna be a real pain to deal with. I mean, again, scorched earth versus scalpel.
Gotcha. How do you know when you're big enough to actually make this worth it? Like, is there a certain threshold where you would say, you know what, you're just below this, like, just go and get some revenue? Or is this something you can apply to any size business? Like, when does it become actual doable?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So what I do, I think a lot of people who do what I do are very analytical and they're only focused on the numbers. For me, even more important than the numbers is the human side, right? You have to enjoy your life or else you're not going to do it. And so my thing is, it's not a number. It's when is the pain of what you're paying greater than the pain of moving the company? So, if you're not in the six figures in pre-tax net, I'm personally probably not looking too much at it. We say that we work with 7 and 8 figure entrepreneurs because I like to do things very carefully. I like to have a very high level of service. I'm basically providing the service that I wish existed for me, where everything is handled for me. If someone's making $90,000 a year in profit, they're not going to get a good ROI with me. If someone's making $1 million a year in profit, we're going to knock it out of the park. And so I think, especially if you're an American, you got to be in the six figures because it's complicated. You got to get professional advice. The biggest thing I see is people come to me and they think they've done everything correctly, and I find out actually you did it all wrong, and you have a $400,000 bill that you're going to get eventually when they figure out that you've done it wrong. Seen that multiple times. So I think really the six figures. Now, the other thing to keep in mind beyond just the income tax is the capital gains tax. So if you're building up a business, we just had a guy recently sell an Amazon business, I think for 6 or 7 million. The capital gains side, that is a harder side to deal with for Americans. It can be done.
Did he sell that
But
business back to another American company?
you can sell it to whomever, but
Okay.
again, it's easier to exempt earned income overseas than it is capital gains tax income. So you need some more or different kinds of strategies for exempting capital gains. But understand, if you plan on selling your business, there's two methods that they could use. In some cases, the method is what's the amount of time that you spent in the U.S. versus overseas. And so this is more of like a Puerto Rico thing, moving to Puerto Rico, where if you own the business for 10 years and you were in Puerto Rico for 5, you get a 50% exclusion. Whereas,
from the U.S.
correct, yeah.
Okay.
So because Puerto Rico is kind of like the tax haven for Americans within the United States.
Yeah.
If you want to go overseas, whether you're an American or whether you're from somewhere else, generally what happens when you become an expat is it's based on what's the value of the business when you leave. So I'll give you an example. We had a guy who had a business. He called me about 2 years ago. We helped him out, create a plan. Business is worth about 30 million bucks. Decided he wanted to kind of think about it some more. Came back about 1.5 years, 2 years later. Hey, now I'm selling the business for 50 million. What can I do? And we found some things like, okay, you can save 800 grand here, 300 grand there, whatever. But we missed on this opportunity to save capital gains tax on $20+ million. And so, if you're planning on selling your business in the future, that is something to keep in mind, that you want to get out as soon as possible, so as not to accumulate more time in the high tax country, or so not to be clocking up the value in the high tax country. So those are two things to keep in mind if you're going to be selling.
So yeah, so if you're going to in the future, basically, if this is something that's on the horizon, get that sooner rather than
And
later.
by the way, I have a gentleman who they raised money. They raised a couple rounds of financing, and the company got away from him. It's now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He can't afford to do this now.
Hmm, okay. Would it make
So
would it make sense? It makes me think, if let's say someone was listening and they don't even have any corporate structure yet and they're just thinking about starting, would it make sense just to do this off the bat, like just incorporate it in wherever now and just kind of skip over, skip the in between step, or is that something you wouldn't advise?
I think it's a great thing to do. But again, here's the psychological issue, which I think is important, right? I mean, you live in the United States. I lived in Arizona. If you want to do it yourself, and you can set up an LLC in Arizona for like $50. I mean, literally, you fill out the forms, you set it in with $50. You can be your own registered agent if you live there. That's cheap. You want to go offshore, companies are going to cost more. And if you're not, and if you're going to go to someone who does the job properly, rather than cheap offshore companies, RUS dot RU, then it's going to cost you, thousands of dollars, depending on where you go. I mean, I've got a guy in the Cayman Islands. It costs him $30,000 a year to keep his corporate structure intact.
Wow.
Um,
Okay, I did
no,
not realize that.
that's kind of like the Cadillac, but in the
Yep.
UAE costs a little less, and maybe something else costs a little less. But again, if you're going like if you're not going to Belize, I mean, that's the cheapest. They'll take anybody. But if you're going to somewhere decent, it's going to cost you money. Then, as an American, there's no way I'm going offshore without getting proper advice, because there's just so many things to do offshore: how to run it, how to distribute the money to yourself, how to take your salary, how to keep it, how to do the filings. I mean, that's going to be not cheap. If you're willing to invest that money, that's fine. I mean, if I'm starting a new business now, right? I mean, I sold a couple of businesses in the U.S. I ran others. I have cash. I have a cash business now. Yeah, I'm doing it correctly. But if I'm starting this business and I've got $1,000 in the bank, yeah, you can certainly go overseas and you can do things like the foreign earned income exclusion. You're not going to maximize it without a corporate structure, but something's better than nothing. So, I think that you have to be committed to put some money into this. And so, when generally in the past, when people have come to me and said, "Hey, we're starting a business," I often shy away from them, just because I know that it's much easier to help someone to get the job done, especially with a premium service, when they have the pain of having already written the check, right? I mean, I grew up as a kind of a libertarian. I was as a kid. These taxes are terrible. Blah 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 blah. It's almost like, and forgive the crudeness, it's almost like masturbation, right? Until you're writing the big check, you don't really know what the pain is.
Got it. So yeah, it sounds like go out there and get a little revenue under your belt, pay some taxes at that point, and then you'll be kind of ready to start looking. It's one of those things, right? You go out and start
Yeah,
like getting a big warehouse. Like it would be an example, right? Of I'm going to start an e-commerce business. I'm going to go out and get a 100,000 square foot warehouse because we'll grow into it. And some people might, right? Like, and some folks have the capital and they know they can scale. They've done it before. But if you're just getting started, it might be, walk before you run, sort of thing. Is what you're saying.
yeah. I think if you talk to, and I love talking to older folks, and I've had the privilege in the last year or so, we've had about a dozen, ultra high net worth folks come through. Most of them are a bit older, and I think what they would all tell you, everyone I know who's in their 50s and wealthy, would say, don't bite off more than you can chew. Pay a little bit more, as an insurance policy, just to avoid sinking too much capital. Now, obviously, what you have to make sure. What I see people doing is they get stuck where things are going so well and they're so busy managing the growth, they don't have time to do all this stuff. And so that's why, what I've tried to do in our business is create something where it's like, we'll fill out forms for you. We'll do as much of the lifting as possible because you're busy. So what you have to be cognizant of is, okay, when you get to that level and you're making $200,000 a year, you got to set aside the time to make the move, because otherwise you'll be this guy with the multi-$100 million company before you know it, and then it'll be too late.
Gotcha.
So
So
it's kind of a fine line.
yeah. Well, okay. So let's say, so I know you guys do this, and let's say someone's
Yeah.
listening, they do want to find a professional. What questions should they be asking to even make sure they're talking to the right professional, right? Because I, I'm assuming there's someone who focuses on UAE taxes, but that's probably not the person you want to go talk to. And like you said, you don't want to talk to uh, a accountant in Arizona because they're not going to help you. So how do you even go about finding someone to help you?
Well, so what I've been trying to do over these last 13 years is put together this network because, again, I've realized doing it myself, it all fits together as a puzzle. So the first thing you want in your puzzle is you want to have a guy um, who is a professional in your own country for expats specifically or for international. Okay, they may be in Arizona or wherever your country is,
Okay,
but
so
they focus on
if
international.
if you live in the U.S., someone that focuses on international in the U.S. with you.
I probably know everyone who does this at a decent level, and there's not that many of them. But yeah, you want someone who's international focused. If you're doing well, I mean, so there's a number of expat tax preparers for, hey, I live in Switzerland and have a job, and I got to file my tax return in the U.S., but there's not much complicated. You want someone who's really focused on business, okay? Because it's not just a matter of filing a tax return; it's a whole matter of structuring. Now, again, if you're in other countries, you want someone there. The work is not going to be as much ongoing in those other countries as it is in the U.S. Because again, as long as you're a U.S. citizen, you've got obligations, whereas someone else will just help you get out of the system and then go on your merry way. Make sure you stay out of the system. Then what you also want is you want to figure out, where can you go and get set up. Again, you want to find someone, in my opinion, who's more independent. If you call the lawyer in Panama, their solution is going to be Panama. They're going to tell you why Panama works, and they don't really care if you can get a merchant account. They don't really care how U.S. tax works. And so, what you needed to get them doing is you need to get them talking, right? Because you want to make sure that whatever you're doing in Panama or Timbuktu or Hong Kong or wherever is not running afoul of the U.S. And that's the hard part. It sounds like, you're really focusing on folks in the U.S. The U.S. tax code is so different from so many other tax codes that you want to make sure that what you're doing in one country isn't screwing you in the other country. So you need to get those two guys talking. And then let's say your company's in the UAE, but you're not a resident in the UAE, so then you need to bank somewhere else. Well, now you need to make sure that that banker's involved and knows what's going on in the UAE, and then maybe the merchant account is in the U.S. or somewhere else, and then they need to be involved. And so, I would start with the tax and go from there. And then again, you also need to figure out where you're going that's going to solve your side of the personal tax equation. So that may be a residence permit, et cetera. If that residence permit involves an investment, then again, you want to loop in the U.S. tax guy to make sure that you're paying any U.S. tax on that investment, reporting it if it's a bank account, et cetera.
Would you personally, would you decide on the business where to move the business first, or personally where to move first, or do you have to do that together? Is that something you can just kind of do independently of one another?
Yeah, I do think that they should be done together. They should be taken into consideration together. Again, plenty of people have gone out and said, "Hey, I'm going to travel the world." This is what I did. People think Andrew talks. He never stops talking about tax. Listen, I have a business that we help people, do this stuff, and people's complaint is I'm paying too much in tax. But my original thing when I was sitting at the Phoenician Hotel at 24 years old was, where do I want to live? And as I started to travel, you could do that. You could go out and live the digital nomad lifestyle, and then as you go, go back and take the foreign earned income exclusion, for example, if you're overseas. That's a personal exclusion on your tax return, and then you can figure the structure from there. But ideally, you want to figure them out together because you want it to work together. And the hardest thing for me is when someone says, "Hey, I want to live in Spain." Makes tax planning a lot harder if you want to live full time in Spain. Spain ain't exactly a low tax country,
Hmm.
so
Okay, yeah. So thinking of this all together sounds like the easiest route, or
yeah,
but you
you
don't have
can
to.
do it the other way, but you could just live the personal lifestyle first and kind of cobble the structure together as you go. Make sure you're not making mistakes in that case. But yeah, I think if you're going to be serious about it, it's good to handle as much concurrently as possible.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I think this is super helpful. It makes it sound a lot more approachable because I feel like when you start talking about these terms, it sounds very kind of, I don't know, scary and just something that's like, I don't know, those other people do that. We don't, not something we do. They do that. But this sounds a lot more approachable the way you're explaining it. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
And
I walk the line between. I don't want to make it sound like you just go and. Again, you don't want to just go out and set up your company and take a flight and just hope for the best. That said, it's a fully 100% legal if you do it properly. There may be some forms to file or some accounts to report or whatever you want to play. They call me the goody two shoes of the offshore business because so many other guys are like doing the Wolf of Wall Street thing or hiding out behind a bush somewhere. That's not what I'm doing. I like to be, very upfront, but you can do it legally. You can do it properly. You want to be properly structured, especially if you're an American. Take it from me. Yeah, it was a pain at first, but once you get it figured out, I like to look at what's the 10-year return. Can you save $1 million, $2 million, $5 million in taxes? To me, that makes it worth it.
So do it legally because you don't want to end up in a Belize prison. So I think that's good advice right
Or
there.
even worse, an American prison.
Or an American, you don't want to end up in a prison, period. So
no prisons.
no prisons. All right. If people want to find you, kind of learn more about you, where can they do so?
Probably the best place to start for someone who's new is I wrote a book called Nomad Capitalist. You can find that on Amazon. We have over 1,500 articles from 7 years at nomadcapitalist.com, 700 videos plus on YouTube. Search Nomad Capitalist. And if you want to kind of dive into this, we offer a service, but we are also putting together Nomad Capitalist Live, which is our conference coming up in September 2020. We got some big names coming to that. So there's lots of different places to start, depending on how deep you want to dive in. But for someone who's brand new, I think the book is a great place to start and just immerse yourself in what's possible, shed some of the myths, and start getting some ideas.
Very cool. I will link to all that in the show notes. So thank you very much for coming on, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Great to be with you.